Okay, but let's pretend that rather than making a mistake with the whole row so that I had to pull it all out, I was just knitting along and suddenly I realized that I had made a mistake and this should have been a purl instead of a knit. So let's just pretend. In that case, I'm not going to rip out the whole round. Instead, I'm going to drop down. So here's what I do. I take that live stitch off the needle and I'm pinching with my thumb and middle finger so that it's not going to go very far. I pull it out, and then if I want to make it into a purl stitch instead, I put this working yarn towards the front. Then I put the drop down stitch back on the needle, and it's pretty easy to tell in this case because I switched colors, so you can see that this is a stitch from the row below. And all I do is I purl it so my right needle is going in as if to purl and under that working yarn and then pulling it through. And now I have a purl stitch. Another way to do that, if you are not very dexterous with your needles yet, if you're more of a beginning knitter, because I couldn't do it like that when I started knitting, is so you do the beginning stitches the same way. So you're looking at this. I'm sorry, that was my window deciding to drop a little bit further. Okay, so you're looking at this, and then you can move the stitch to the needle, put the yarn that you've pulled out over it, and then draw the stitch over it. And that makes a purl bump as well. So it's just two ways of achieving the same thing, and you don't have to do quite so much manipulating with your right thing. Okay, so now let's tink back here a few stitches. So now let's say that I'm knitting along and I see that there's a purl bump where there should have been a knit stitch. How am I going to fix that? Pop it off the needles, pull it out while pinching, and now knit stitches, the yarn always comes from the back. So put that yarn that you've just pulled to the back. Here, I'll drop the working yarn because that doesn't matter right now. Put the stitch from the row below on the needle, and then I hold that yarn in the back, sort of like I would if I were knitting a regular continental row. And I go through and make a knit stitch. So now you've gotten rid of that mistake and you don't have to tink back. And there's another way to do this if you're not so dexterous with your right needle. So once again, in this case, so we're starting from here again. You put the right needle through as if to knit, but you let the stitch move to the right needle instead. Now you put the right needle with your working yarn, the yarn you ripped out, draw it over, and you've got a knit stitch again. So that is my preferred method. I very rarely frog unless it's something like I forgot several increases. If it's just one increase, I'll just go ahead and cheat and add an increase. But in this case, I needed to rip out the whole round. While I'm here, since I showed you how to change a knit stitch into a purl stitch and a purl stitch into a knit stitch, I'll also show you the other thing that you'll need in order to be able to fix mistakes by dropping down, and that is how to add in a yarn over, those kinds of things. So pretend that I'm doing a lace pattern and there should have been a yarn over here and I just forgot to do it. So all I have to do to replicate a yarn over is put my left needle in from the front through the yarn from the row below. So in this case that's really obvious because I've only had one row of the blue. So then just knit into it and there's your yarn over hole. I'll show you. There you go. So it might be a little smaller than the other yarn overs in the row, but not enough to really be noticeable. We can also pretend that you accidentally put a yarn over into a round. And what are you going to do when you get to that? So you don't want that yarn over there. Honestly, I usually just drop it off the needle. I have found that the yarn fabric will still be cohesive. So I found that if it's just one yarn over or a couple in a row, that the fabric will just absorb that extra yarn without too many problems, especially once you block it. So that's the main way I fix an accidental yarn over. There is another method if you are really worried, and all you do is do a knit two together, but that creates a little more of a hole in my opinion than just dropping that yarn over off the stitch. So that's how I fix that. Let's see, what else is there to fix? Oh, I guess I could show you a more advanced one. So let's say that, as is true in my case, I was supposed to have done an increase and I forgot to do the increase, and for whatever reason I can't just add the increase to this current row. It has to be in the row below. Okay, so what are we going to do? So this is the yarn from the row below, and it should have been knit into an increase stitch, and it was not. One thing you could do is put it on as if it was a yarn over and knit it like that. But let's say for whatever reason you want you don't want to use a yarn over increase. This was a twisted yarn over increase. That's why I didn't make a hole. You knit it through the back loop. Anyway, let's say that didn't work in your pattern. You really needed to do a make one left. So in that case, what you would do is, instead of focusing on the strand from the row below, go 2 rows below. Pick that up, put it on your left needle, drop your working yarn. So now you're just going to do a regular make one left, but instead of using the working yarn to do the knit stitch, you're going to use the yarn from 1 row below. And I find it easiest if I just kind of pinch it and hold it out like that. So for make one left, you put the right needle through the back of the loop, then you've got that yarn on your needle and you draw it through. And now you've put your increase right where it would have been if you had done it the first time. If you have forgotten a whole bunch of increases, then you might end up using a little too much yarn and making the row a bit too tight. But if you're just missing 1 or 2, then I find this works just as well. And if you had forgotten to do a make one right, I would pick up the same way and then just reverse it, because from a make one right you come from the back. So I guess what you could do is, and remember, we haven't dropped any stitches because this is an increase, we're just spreading the fabric out. So ignore the strand from the row directly below. The strand that's 2 rounds below, go in from the back, and now pinch the yarn from 1 round below as if it was your working yarn. Basically, you want it in that same position. Put your right needle through the front, get that yarn up over it, and this can be a bit fiddly depending on what weight yarn you're using. And there is a make one right. So essentially, once you realize that these strands in your knitting can function the same way as working yarn, you can drop down and change your knitting however you want. I've dropped down and added cables or texture or switched which direction the cables were going. And all you have to do is keep all of your strands straight, which sometimes is easier said than done. So let's say you needed to drop down 4. Okay, so now you've got quite a few strands of yarn, right? So just double check, and I've dropped down more than 4. Can you tell I really don't like ripping out if I don't have to? So just make sure all those strands stay in the same order when you knit them back up. And then it's just the same process. You put them on the needle, you double check which strand needs to go first, hold it, and knit through. I will admit that being a continental knitter, This is probably why I find this style of dropping down and fixing mistakes very easy for me. It would be trickier if I was trying to throw those little strands of yarn. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, so there isn't much to work with, but you can still do it. Or if you are a thrower and you're not comfortable with continental style knitting, what you can do is the other option I showed you, where you have the stitch that you drop down, move it to your right needle, put the strand that needs to go through it also on the right needle, and use the left needle to pick it up and go over. So, as with all knitting, there are multiple ways to accomplish the same thing, and it's just a question of finding the right method for you. But hopefully that was helpful.